Welcome to video number 4. This one goes with the biodiversity and ecosystem notes. So when we're talking about ecosystems, there's a lot of different terms like habitat, ecosystem, biodiversity, populations, and it can get very complicated. So what do actually all these terms mean? Well, firstly, a population is a group of organisms living in a habitat. So when I look in the back garden, there are a number of birds that live in the hedges, they breed there, they feed in the actual garden, they essentially spend their lives in that garden. So the garden is their habitat, and they are the population of birds that live there. Now, the habitat then is the area that that population lives and spends its life. They might occasionally leave the area, but they spend the majority of their lives in that particular area. Some animals do migrate to different habitats during their lifetimes, but a lot of organisms spend all their life in one particular habitat. So a habitat could be just a forest, a garden, a river, as long as it's got a population of species living within it. Then we've got this term of ecosystem. So what's an ecosystem then? Well, an ecosystem is kind of like a habitat, but it doesn't just include the place where they live, but all the organisms that are in it, how they interact, and all the different factors that influence them. So when you take, for instance, a tropical rainforest, it's not just the rainforest itself, but also the snakes, the tarantulas, the poison arrow frogs, which ones feed off which ones compete, do the diseases get spread from one to another, and then all the factors that influence them there, the temperature, the humidity, the amount of light. So all these things added up makes up the tropical rainforest ecosystem. So the habitat is just the tropical rainforest, the idea where it lives, whereas the ecosystem is everything that's made up in that particular area. So the final term that you'll come across in this section is biodiversity. And biodiversity is the variety of species that live in an area. So where there's plentiful amounts of nutrients, not much maybe, there's plenty of shelter, easy breeding, not many diseases, there's going to be a high biodiversity because lots of different species will survive. Particularly if there's different types of foods to feed off, then the different species can survive because they're all adapted to feed on different types of food. So when it's plentiful conditions, biodiversity will be high. There's a lot of different types of species breeding in that area and living there. Whereas if you take somewhere that's more harsh, for instance, a bare rock face, a volcanic area, deep in the ocean where there's very high pressures, high altitudes, all those areas, because of the conditions aren't favourable for survival, the organisms that survive there have to be much more hardy and adapted to survive there, and as a result there's going to be fewer species, less biodiversity. So biodiversity is the variety of species that live in a habitat. More plentiful conditions, the higher the biodiversity, the more harsh the conditions, the weaker, the less the biodiversity. Well, a good example of a habitat to look at would be, and see the ecosystems and how it's influenced, is the examples of a deciduous and a conifer forest, otherwise known as an evergreen forest. The difference between these two is that a deciduous forest, the trees release their leaves every year, like for example with an oak tree, and that's going to break down, creating nutrients in the soil and promoting, making it a much more like a friendly environment. Whereas conifers, such as pine trees, they don't have an annual dropping of their leaves. They tend to drop their pines any time of the year, and they will have a big influence, as we see now. So deciduous trees are much more delicate, whereas conifers are very hardy plants. So a conifer can survive in conditions where there aren't as many nutrients, they don't need as much. Sandy soils, which we'll look at soils in another a set of notes, but sandy soils, conifers are able to grow in them, whereas the deciduous trees need loamy soil or clay soil, so there's plenty of nutrients there. Another factor is that conifer usually have needles shaped leaves, and these are, because of the thin, small shape of them, together they have a much larger surface area when you add up the mass, and they let less light through. Now that's going to mean that any plants which are trying to grow below them will have a much more difficult job, because there's less light getting through. Whereas with deciduous, these broad-shaped leaves, light passes through them as well as being picked up. So underneath, you get lots of different plants and shrubs and bushes growing underneath the deciduous forest. It gets through the canopies above. The pine needles in conifers also have a damaging effect on the soil because they're acidic. So you'll essentially have a layer of acidic needles building up underneath, and that will create harsh conditions for the plants growing. So not only do they have very little light, but they'll also have to they'll have to be able to breed in acidic conditions, whereas the deciduous forests don't create this. It means lichens and mosses are favourable in conifers because they like those sort of conditions, but other bushes like brambles aren't going to grow well in the conifer forests. It's going to be more in the deciduous ones.